I'm Alice.
And I'm Brett.
And this is the Prosecutor's Legal Briefs. Welcome back to the Prosecutor's Legal Briefs. I'm your host, Alice, and I'm joined, as always, by my pedigreed co-host, Brett.
Hi, Alice. I have missed you. I'm glad to be back with you, and I'm glad to be talking about this case. I didn't know if we'd ever get to have an update on this one, and excited's not the right word. I am interested to see how this goes, and I hope there's resolution at the end.
Absolutely, Brett. So I literally rushed home today. I was out of town. We weren't going to record until Friday. This case, the pedigreed, was for Asha Degree, if you didn't pick that up, because this has been one of the cases. It was one of the earliest cases we covered. We have talked about it in so many episodes as a case that we want attention on because we feel it can be solved. And truthfully, I didn't know if there would ever be a break. It's been almost 24 years. And there's been almost no movement in the case, no arrest in the case. But finally this week, there was a break in the case, and we're going to talk about it today. I'm not saying I rushed back from out of town just to record this, but it was certainly on my mind, and I had to stay up late to read a search warrant that was unsealed in this case.
Yeah, Alice, and I think this is a good, just before we even get into the case, this is a good reminder that there are truly no cold cases. You can always have a break. This case has been going on for 24 years. I think a lot of us worried that we might never have a break in this case. And yet here we are today. And that's one of the reasons we always say when we cover these cases, no matter how old they are, listen and see if anything strikes a chord with you, if there's anything that sort of lifts the veil on a case. And we're going to talk about something that's been solving a lot of cases, or at least pushing them closer to being solved, genetic genealogy. But there's also some witnesses who saw things that I think also push this case forward. So just, don't give up and don't think just because it's been a long time, even if it's been decades, that we're never going to solve a case.
Absolutely. And one other thing, when search warrants or other affidavits or documents are unsealed, remember it's just part of the case. There is a purpose. We've talked about this before, and we'll talk about it here. There's a purpose for the search warrant. This search warrant is not meant to be a laying out of all the evidence of what happened to Asha Degree. So you need to read it for what it is. It is in order to have probable cause for a judge to grant the right for the police to search a specific property. It is not meant to lay out an entire case. So keep that in mind. There are going to be questions that are unanswered that we cannot answer from this search warrant. And that's the way it should be, because these documents are not meant to be press releases. They are meant to do a very specific thing, which is in this case to suspend someone's constitutional right to privacy in order to enter a private property, search and seize items. So keep that in mind as we go through the search warrant.
And I think it's also important to remember, and it's great that Alice pointed this out, because I think this is an important thing to talk about at the beginning. Obviously, all of us are doing it. We're going to do it in this episode. You see something like this, it's the first real movement in the case in 20 years. You dig into it, your mind starts racing, you're forming theories, you're coming to conclusions. Remember, this is a search warrant affidavit. And those of you who follow true crime know search warrant affidavits, they can actually be a little misleading, because while they tell you what the police know at the time, and the purpose is to show a judge that there's probable cause to think that there might be evidence of a crime at a certain location, it doesn't mean, number one, that the police know everything. In fact, oftentimes they won't. It doesn't mean that the people who are being searched are going to end up being responsible for the crime. I mean, I think back to Delphi. You guys all remember Ron Logan. There was a search warrant early on in that case. If you read that search warrant affidavit, you get a pretty strong feeling that maybe Ron Logan was involved. And there's a lot of people who've never been able to let go of that, even though it seems like police have definitively ruled him out in that case. It's something important to remember here. These are not arrest warrant affidavits, for instance, which usually are telling you more of the police's theory. These affidavits and these warrants, and there are several of them, they all have basically the same affidavit, but there were several warrants executed. They are attempting really to paint for the magistrate judge who has to sign off on these the broadest possible picture of probable cause because the police want to search as many places as possible that they reasonably believe are connected to the crime. So just remember that when you're reading through it, and we're going to go through some of the language and how some of it might be misleading and how some people I think have been misled by some of the language, but we don't know a lot. The one thing I would say, it's fun to come up with theories. I'm not saying don't, we're all doing it. But to the extent you can use the information, if you are actually in the area and might have real evidence to jog your memory or to make you think of certain things or interactions with certain people, anything like that, that could be really valuable to this case. I know we have listeners who live in Shelby, North Carolina, and I hope all of you and really the surrounding area are reading these affidavits, thinking about them, and thinking about whether or not you might have information that's 25 years old, but that could push this case even further forward. So with that, I guess we can dive in. Alice, I do want to say thanks to Jennifer. Jennifer sent us a lot of these affidavits for reasons that are unclear. You know, the locals didn't want to put this affidavit online. It was public, but they couldn't just make a PDF of it for everybody. So you basically had to go get it or get it through the mail, and people have been scrambling to get it. So thank you to Jennifer for helping us. And really, there've been a lot of sleuths who've done this, and you guys have all done a great job on this. Okay, for those of you who are not familiar with this case, I think most of you probably are, but just a very quick overview. We covered this case on our other podcast, The Prosecutors, probably 200 episodes ago. It's been a while, but it was one of the first cases that really affected us, and it's one that we've talked about a lot. And I think it's one that Alice and I have both said is one we want solved at the very top of our list of wanting cases solved. This is it. So Asha Degree, she was 9 years old when she went missing in February 2000, Valentine's Day, as a matter of fact. That night, it was stormy, it was dark. She basically, it seems like, left of her own volition in the middle of the night. Gets up, has a backpack, leaves the front door, locks the door behind her, starts walking down the road in the rain. There are multiple people who see her. There's a couple different truckers who see her and will later report seeing her walking down the street. Some items of hers are going to be found in a shed near like a furniture store further down the road from her house. She disappears. There's an extensive search. Other than those items found in the shed, no trace of her is discovered. A year and a half later, a backpack wrapped in 2 black garbage bags will be unearthed. It's actually buried and found by some people doing some construction work about 30 miles away from her home, I believe in the opposite direction of the one that she was walking. Now, inside this backpack were some personal items and some clothes. We're not exactly sure everything that's in the backpack, but certainly items belonging to Asha and some items that may not have belonged to her. If you move forward to about 2018, the police released a tip. It's unclear why it took them so long to do it, about a green vehicle, 1970s era, sort of, typical boxy green car. The fact that it was green really stood out. At the time, the police said that there was a witness who said they saw someone matching Asha's description getting into the car. As we will see in these affidavits, that is refined a little bit more from getting into the car to actually being pulled into the car.
So essentially, there is nothing more about this case for years. Other than that tip, which they knew about back probably around 2000, there's no additional information, essentially from 2001. There's no sign of Asha, just her belongings. Fast forward almost 24 years to this month. On September 10th and 11th, the FBI and Cleveland County Sheriff's Office executed search warrants and conducted an extensive search on a property along Cherryville Road in Shelby, North Carolina. Now, this search was related to the Asha Degree case. They came out and said this is in relation to the disappearance of Asha Degree. And when you have a search warrant, you also, if it gets granted, you have to return the search warrant to the court and list everything that you seized in that search warrant. So this is how we know what was taken from the property. We know that the police seized a 1964 AMC Rambler, which was green in color, and this vehicle matched the description of the one police believed was connected to Asha's disappearance that they kind of released back in 2016, 2018. And there's also just an interesting thing about this car, not only it being very old, and if you've seen pictures of it online, It doesn't look in drivable shape. It looks like it's been in a junkyard, but it's been on this property for all of this time. The front of the vehicle is damaged. It looks like a little more than a fender bender, but there's certainly damage to the front of it.
Weird thing. This is the second time in a month we've mentioned an AMC Rambler, which is strange.
Not a common car nowadays.
Yeah, I know. I know. It's the second time a Rambler's come up. I don't know what's
That's
going
a
on
good
with
point.
that. Now, look, nobody said they saw a Rambler that night. I think that's one thing to remember. But it was late at night, and the Rambler looks a lot like the vehicles that people said, hey, this could have been these various different 1970s automobiles. So I think the fact that it's a Rambler doesn't mean, oh, well, must not be related. As we've said before, we actually don't know when this tip came in. You know, it might have came in 2018. It might have came in 2000, and they held it for 18 years for reasons that are unclear. But that kind of mistake is actually one that doesn't surprise me much at all, particularly at the time where you had a bunch of these sort of long, boxy looking cars that were made by a bunch of different companies. And unless you just are a crazy car person, very easy to mistake that.
And if anything, remember, she disappeared in 2000. This is a 1960s car. So baseline, this was already at the time that she disappeared, kind of like a vintage car, right? It's not a car that you see every day. It was already a 40-year-old car, 35-year-old, 40-year-old car at this time. I personally don't know my cars that well, but I can kind of see a car and say, well, that's like a vintage looking car. So especially because this is kind of an older style car, it doesn't bother me that it wasn't the right make. The green color, however, does stand out because that's a pretty distinctive color. Not black, not white. Remember, it was a stormy, dark night in the middle of the night. And you can imagine a darker car may blend in and it'd be hard to know if the car was black or dark blue, for example. But green stands out no matter kind of what the lighting is.
So we mentioned the Cherry Hill Road search warrant. There's actually several. That's going to be your main one. We'll get into where the other search warrants were executed here in a second. Okay, so according to this affidavit, the affidavit that's attached to these warrants, and search warrants mean basically you have the location to be searched, which has to be with particularity, what you're looking for. This was a pretty broad warrant. They wanted basically everything. Some of these warrants, they took computers, they took cell phones, stuff like that. They took this car, a lot of different things. It's interesting. I mean, you can try and figure out why they took what they took and try and read into that. It's kind of a fool's errand. A lot of times they take just about anything, but it could be significant, and we may find that out in the future. And I do think, by the way, this is only the beginning. Talking about this now, I do not think this is going to be the end. This is the beginning of a story that I think is only going to get more interesting and hopefully more will shine more light on what happened that night. So according to this affidavit, Asha was seen being pulled into a 1970s green Lincoln Thunderbird or similar vehicle the night of February 14th. As we said, this wasn't a Lincoln Thunderbird, but the Rambler looks similar to that vehicle. This, as I said, is different from what was reported, which was that she got into the car. This strikes you as a much more sort of forceful encounter. You think about the things that people have theorized. She left, the parents found out, they got mad, they drove down the road, they saw her, they made her get in the back of the car, and then some punishment went wrong and she died, right? I mean, that's sort of what some people have speculated happened. This sounds much more like some sort of violent encounter, an abduction, right? Not something like that. And I think that's important because I think vindicating this family is important, and we've tried to do that through our coverage, and I think we're going to continue to do that. So they found this backpack, and this is the key. This is the main thing they discovered. When they went through this backpack, they found DNA on an undershirt that was not Asha's. Now look, they found it 20 years ago, probably. I doubt they just found it today, but maybe they did. Genealogy techniques, including gathering DNA, has developed so much in the last 20 years. It's possible they looked back through these. No Othram does this sometimes. They'll get items that have been looked at before, and they'll be able to pull DNA that nobody could pull before. So we don't know exactly, but what we do know is they had this DNA. It wasn't Asha's, and it wasn't something that your traditional DNA technologies were going to give them any information about. And so it appears that they used genetic genealogy, and they were able to say that one sample belonged to a man named Russell Bradley Underhill. So we have Russell Bradley Underhill. He is the source of one part of DNA that is found on one of Asha's shirts. The other DNA match belonged to a hereditary family member of what are described as suspects, Roy Lee Dedman and Connie Elliott Dedman. Now we know that Underhill, the man who was the source of the one DNA, lived in two different facilities that had been operated by the Dedmans during the time that Asha went missing. Cleveland Healthcare and Northbrook Rest Home. These were essentially places for people who either had medical issues or, that needed assisted living, essentially. And this Underhill gentleman, he passed away in 2004. He was only 54 at the time he passed away. So he would have been around 50 when Asha went missing. The other DNA was from a hair that belonged to Annalie Victoria Dedman Ramirez. And she was Roy and Connie's daughter, and she was 13 at the time of the disappearance.
So a few things to note. This DNA is probably, we don't know what state the DNA was. We don't know if it's touch DNA. We know that Annalise was a hair that tied to her, but we don't know for Underhill. But this is really important because we've said time and time again, but it's worth repeating here, especially if you are in a position where you can preserve DNA. This DNA likely was able to be tested now with today's technology. I don't know what the technology was 24 years ago or 23 years ago if we would have been able to find the DNA here. But because it sounds like it's relatively small, at least with a hair, it doesn't indicate that there was a lot of hair. Maybe there was. If that DNA had been consumed back in 2000 before the technology had allowed profiles of use to be able to produce, we would no longer have that DNA today. So whoever was in charge of custody of this DNA, way to go, because the DNA wasn't lost. It was preserved, and it was preserved to a time in which the technology had advanced enough to be able to make use of the DNA that was left, because this may be what ultimately solves the case. This is the first time we've heard of named suspects in the case. And it's very interesting that there's multiple names in the affidavit. We've just said 4 of them, right? Roy, Connie, Russell, and Annalie. But the affidavit specifically lists just 2 of them as suspects.
And I think one thing some of you are probably wondering about Underhill and what he was doing in an assisted living facility when he was 50 and how he died when he was 54. I don't know a lot about him. My understanding was he was possibly, I guess, a Vietnam vet, an alcoholic. We don't really know all his health history. I have a feeling that is going to come out more. That is one of the things that the police wanted in their search warrants, is they really wanted his medical history, his treatment history, that sort of thing. There's a lot of questions that are not answered yet and will be answered through further investigation. All we know now, the direction that the police are moving.
And this is really important too. Part of the reason we don't know a lot about Underhill, except that the DNA leads to who this search warrant has to do with, is because this is a search warrant for Roy and Connie's address, and then it kind of leads down and describes why Underhill points to who the police believe are suspects. This is an example where there's probably more information about Underhill that the police know about, but it's not relevant for purposes of this warrant, so they don't need to put it in here. This is only for purposes of getting the search warrant for this property. And one other thing about Underhill, we will probably find out more about him, but a couple things that you could probably note. Passing away at 54 is a relatively young age. He was some sort of needing care around the clock at a relatively young age as well, around 50. This points to a number of things. He is currently not listed as a suspect. He passed away 20 years ago, but the police haven't said, well, the case is over now because we had our guy, he's dead, we're done, right? So I think there's a lot to be said about the fact that he was 50 at the time, in assisted living, or in some need of medical care, probably around the clock, and passed away at a pretty young age. And yet, this search warrant is still going forward. In other words, I don't think he's the focus of this investigation right now. With that, as I noted, there was a hair found on Aisha's undershirt that was in the backpack that was uncovered from being put in the trash bag dug up by construction workers. Now, we know that hair belonged to Anna Lee Victoria Dedman Ramirez. We also know that she was one of Roy and Connie's 3 daughters and relatively young, but Aisha was 9 at the time and Anna Lee was 13. I think that's noteworthy too, because we've talked a lot about whether Aisha was leaving her home to meet a friend. Remember, she had that picture of a girl who's been unidentified to this point, but that girl looked about her age. 13 is close-ish to 9, but probably not in the same class. And from what we know right now, there's no connection between Roy and Connie or Anna Lee and Aisha. And the other thing we know from this affidavit is, remember, there are 2 other daughters. Well, the Dedmans, because they owned these 2 healthcare facilities, they would have their 16-year-old daughter, her name was Lizzie Grace Dedman Foster, transport patients from Cleveland Healthcare in, quote, an unreliable vehicle. Maybe a 35 or 40-year-old car might be unreliable. That itself is a little questionable. I don't know what sort of health afflictions these patients had, but instead of hiring maybe like a driver, they had their 16-year-old daughter who probably just got her license transport them. But this is important because in this affidavit, we're getting glimpses into where this DNA could have come from that ended up on Aisha, even if Aisha didn't have direct contact with the people she has DNA affiliated with her. And so what we're reading here is that Underhill may have been transported in this car with the Dedman's daughter, who was driving for purposes of just transporting people, not necessarily driving the night that Aisha disappeared.
Yeah. And so I think, once again, you remember what they're trying to do when they're writing this affidavit. They're giving information that leads to a conclusion that the people that they want to search may be involved in a crime and that evidence of that crime may be where they want to search. And this is part of that. You can sort of see how this is building, right? So in the back of this car, or at some point, and we assume, as Alice said, you don't have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt in a search warrant. You're making logical inferences. So you have this Rambler that is owned by this family. You have reports that an unreliable vehicle is being used to transport patients. Wouldn't surprise me if those patients were in the back seat of that vehicle. You have on this shirt in Aisha's backpack the DNA of one of those patients. You have a patient from this hospital. His DNA is on her shirt. Your initial thought might be, man, he must have had something to do with that. They found his DNA on the shirt. But as we've often cautioned you when it comes to DNA, you have to be more thoughtful about it than that. It could be, and that may be where the police end up. The police may end up saying that this man, he might have been in a rest home, but he was able to do something to Aisha, and maybe he used this car, maybe he borrowed the car that night. That may come out. That is a possible thing. But another possible thing is you don't just have his DNA. You also have this hair. Now, the thing about hairs, it's not like they found the 13-year-old's blood all over the backpack. They found a hair. Hairs, not
fall out all the time.
Not to go back to Dashboard Confessional, but your hair is everywhere, right? And you could imagine if this is a family vehicle that's sometimes used to transport patients, there also probably were some daughters in that car at some point. We know one of the daughters, the 16-year-old, drove it. Would it be that surprising if the 13-year-old was in the back seat at some point? And imagine you've got DNA from the patient who rode in the back seat, and then you have a hair from the daughter. And then imagine that Asha Degree is pulled into the back of that car. Someone throws her in the back of the car, pulls her into the back of the car, and drives off with her. What is something you could imagine would happen at that point? Transfer. A hair ending up on her undershirt, a DNA transferring to her undershirt, and then all of a sudden you have an explanation of how this DNA got to the backpack in the first place. And you see how all this is coming together. The car, the patient, the hair. It all sorts to start to point to you to a story that could have possibly happened here, and that might lead a magistrate to say, you know what, you're right. I can see that. You need to go search and see if there's even more evidence that your theory is correct. Now, one thing they say in the affidavit, which I think has thrown people a little bit, is that given the age of the daughters, because they're all teenagers, 17 and under, that adult assistance would be necessary to commit the crime. And some people have led this to be, well, they're saying assistance. So that means it must have been one of the daughters and the parents helped them. But back up a little bit and remember what we're talking about. We're talking about a search warrant. Now, it is possible, of course, that the police believe that one or more of the daughters are responsible for this and the parents covered it up. And that probably is maybe even an avenue of investigation because you do have the DNA of the daughter and the police should run down that possibility. But it is equally possible, if not more likely, that this is not actually meant to accuse the daughters, but it is explaining why there should be warrants for the adult Deadmans and their property when there's no direct link to them in the evidence. Remember, the only link you have to the Deadmans in the evidence is the DNA of the daughter. So you could imagine a judge saying, look, I get it. You got the daughter's DNA, but why do you get to search her house? Why do you get to search the mom's house? Why do you get to search the dad's house? And you say, you put this in there. Well, Your Honor, even if the daughter is the chief suspect, assume it was, there's no way she could have done this alone, which means there's probably evidence of the crime at the parents' house as well. So you include that paragraph in there, not necessarily saying we think the daughters did it, but they would have needed assistance, but to broaden the scope of the search warrant and to explain why there's probable cause beyond just the daughter to search other properties as well.
So that was spot on. A lot of people have read that sentence or paragraph to say, daughters did it. They hit her with a car and parents covered it up. No. When you write affidavits, you have to think about what the judge is going to ask you. And the exact question that Brett raised right there, whether the judge actually asked them that or not, and they had to go back and edit an affidavit, we've had to do that before. You have a back and forth with the judge and they're like, I'm not convinced of this, this, and this. You're not explaining a logical leap here. Go and edit and come back. That's happened to me before. Or the lawyer and investigator who are drafting this affidavit think ahead of what the judge is going to say. Because of the DNA coming back to a minor and an unrelated guy, right? Underhill. Unrelated in the sense that he didn't live at their home, didn't own that vehicle. They have to explain why it triangulates to the parents. Especially right now, we're searching a property 24 years later when the daughter, whose DNA is directly tied to Asha's belongings, doesn't live at that property. You can't just make these leaps without explaining to the judge why there's probable cause. You have to lay, if there's like a brick path, you have to lay every single brick along the way. You can't make these leaps without explaining how you got there. It's a mental exercise, but it's important, and that's why it reads that way as well. I'm not discounting that the kids could have had something to do with it. But I think this particular inclusion in the affidavit wasn't meant to explain anything about what the police know about the kids, other than that the focus of the search warrant is the parents.
And remember, as we've seen, I mean, you guys are all following true crime. Y'all are all lawyers by now. You could all be defense attorneys. You know what? Let's say tomorrow Roy was arrested, or the mom was arrested and charged with a crime. And based on things that were found during the search, what's the first thing a defense attorney is going to try and do? Suppress the search, suppress the evidence. And what's the kind of thing they point to? Think of the Franks motion in the Delphi case. You say, look, the affidavit is deficient on its face. It does not show enough information that a reasonable magistrate should have approved it. So therefore, whatever they found afterwards doesn't come in. So not including this kind of language is the kind of thing where if you don't do that, you don't make that sort of logical connection that Alice is talking about and the magistrates want to see, it can be an attack later on. So it was smart to really explain exactly why it is, even if it's logical in your mind. You're thinking, well, duh, of course, 13-year-old couldn't have done it by himself. You still need to write it down, and the magistrate judge needs to read it, and they need to say, yep, makes sense to me. And so this protects the affidavit from that future attack.
Okay, so what all was searched? Well, there were a number of places that were searched. First, the one we've been talking about mostly where we got a lot of this information is where Connie and Roy lived at the time that Asha disappeared in 2000. And that's 601 Cherryville Road. And if you look at a map, it's under 10 miles from Asha's house. It's not far at all, just south of her house. Interesting to note, it's in the direction of the shed where her the candy wrapper and kind of little items from her backpack were found, but it's in the opposite direction of where her backpack was tied into a garbage bag and buried. So, but it's all kind of on this road over here. Thing to note, Connie and Roy lived together and seemed to be together as a married couple with their 3 daughters at this time. This is where they lived with their family. Today, though,
they now live separately. Yeah.
They now live separately, so they're no longer together. And that's relevant because sometimes when you move, you take things with you. And also when you have 2 suspects who live in 2 different places, this is why there's going to be multiple search warrants. So another search warrant was for the Northbrook Rest Home, which is one of the 2 facilities that were owned. But today it's owned by Anna Lee. And that's interesting because obviously we know that Anna Lee's direct DNA was found on the items recovered from the backpack, right? So no matter what, you have to explain that. If you are, whoever you charge, and if it's not Anna Lee, you're going to have to explain why direct DNA evidence, even if it's of a 13-year-old, is on the property found affiliated with a missing girl. And that is located at 7426 Walnut Wood Drive. Another search warrant was for where Connie lives today, because she lives separate from Roy, and that's 5106 Hawthorne Lane. So in other words, there's the original family home where Roy, Connie, and all 3 daughters, including Anna Lee, lived back in 2000 when Asha disappeared. And then there is a property owned by Anna Lee today, and then a property owned and resided in today by Connie.
I think you can see how, they're focusing in on this case. I mean, they're going to have the search warrant at the rest home, which is where the individual we named earlier was when he died. Like I said, they want his medical history, his medical records, all that sort of stuff. But beyond that, and maybe he didn't have another place that you could search, but beyond that, they're not searching a lot of his places. But they are searching Roy, where he lived before, where he lives now. They're searching Connie, where she lives now. They're searching Anna Lee, where she lives now. They're getting DNA from Connie and Anna Lee. I mean, they seem to be, they don't know. I mean, people want to know, well, what's the police's theory? I don't know that they have a concrete theory. They may have a concrete theory, but they're not pursuing it to the exclusion of all others. They got these 3 people who they think are suspects in some way. I mean, they call Roy and Connie suspects in the affidavit. But you can imagine you're following up on the daughter. She was 13 at the time. It's hard to even imagine how she could be involved in this in any direct way. But you go to her house. I mean, who knows? Maybe you find some sort of evidence of that she did this, and then you wrap the case up, and it's a bizarre case, a truly just unusual way this would be wrapped up. But anyways, you run it down. Or you go to her house, you don't find anything, you move on. You don't know about Connie and Roy. You don't know if they're involved at all. You don't know if they're involved together, if they are involved. You don't know which one of them would be involved because you just don't have that much information. The affidavit, we've given you basically the facts that they're using to justify these searches. They don't go much further than that. So you go to both places, you see what you can find. I think it's pretty clear that the police, they thought they might have had something on Roy because as you continue to read these affidavits, you read that one person who lived in one of these homes said there were 3 rooms that were padlocked in the house that were said to contain Roy's personal items. I mean,
so specifically, I think the family no longer lives there, but they still own the property and rent to a person who has lived there for many years. And in all those years, these 3 doors have been padlocked, which I've rented houses before. Maybe one closet is locked with personal belongings that people keep. But I thought that was really interesting that he'd been there, 3-4 years? He didn't just move in, but several years. And he told police that no, those are padlocked. And clearly based on the returned warrant, a lot of the Deadmans' personal belongings were still in this house that they had vacated several years earlier, which is really interesting, right? Things like journals, those are personal effects, right? Usually when people move out of a home, they take their things with them, like their pictures and their books and their clothes, especially if they don't plan to come back anytime soon, which it doesn't seem like they have, which leads you this part is not based on the facts. This is just conjecture. Why leave those things behind? Why leave them behind presumably in a locked room, things that may have personal, sentimental value. Is it because, and then why did the police seize them? Well, from an outsider, it's going to look like their personal affects kept in a property that the suspects no longer occupy that were of value to be seized as part of the search warrant in connection with a potential homicide, which is what the police have listed, the potential crime, because you have to list what you think the crime is for Asha Degree. That lets me think that they left behind things and tried to hide it in a different location they're no longer at that may have value to this investigation. And one other thing I want to note about what we know that is unspoken just based on the number of search warrants, and there could be more search warrants, absolutely. There could be search warrants under seal right now that we don't know about yet. But note, I know a lot of you are focusing on Anna Lee, and you should be. Her DNA is what it came back to. But I think you're focusing on the wrong thing, because there is a direct link for probable cause for search warrants for Anna Lee. So relatively, it's the easiest to get a search warrant for Anna Lee's property. It's harder because you have to make those evidentiary and logical leaps to get to Roy and Connie, who are the parents, who have no direct tie. The fact that they are taking those leaps in order to get harder to get warrants speaks to me that Anna Lee is the bridge in which to get to Roy and Connie, who the police are actually interested in. So I understand the fixation, especially a lot of you in the chat keep saying, can you charge a 13-year-old? The 13-year-old has to do with it. What about Anna Lee? I think you're focusing on the wrong thing, because look at what affidavits we have here and then look at what we don't have. Again, it may come up later. There is not a search warrant for the daughter who drove the Rambler. That's really important here, because we know from the affidavit facts that the 16-year-old transported people, so transported Underhill, who does have DNA. So if you wanted to make one of these evidentiary leaps to get a warrant for the 16-year-old daughter, you could, because it would look something like this. Underhill lived in one of these properties. His DNA was traced back to the backpack, undershirt, whatever, that was affiliated with Asha. We know that at the time that Asha disappeared, the 16-year-old daughter regularly drove the car that was spotted by an eyewitness, seeing a girl that matched Asha's description being pulled into the car, drive this car, and often transported patients. Underhill was a patient. Therefore, because we know that Underhill was in a medically, compromised position, he would probably need someone of a younger strength, like a 16-year-old, to be able to help in the commission of a crime. Therefore, Judge, we have probable cause to search the former 16-year-old's search warrant. So if they wanted to do that, they could. We may find out in a month there is a search warrant for it. But the fact that there isn't one so far lets me to believe that Anna Lee is not the focus of this investigation, nor is Underhill, nor any of the daughters.
Yeah, I mean, they're the connections to the Deadmans, is what it seems like. And, we talk about search warrants sometimes, and it's easy to just sort of get this like, well, they should seize everything. Well, why not? There's a third daughter that we haven't even talked about. Why didn't they seize her stuff? Maybe she's involved. The problem is we don't have any evidence she's involved. And you can't you're protected by the Constitution. You have to show a reason. I mean, Alice was sort of trying to build the chain of causality to get you to the 16-year-old if you wanted to search her stuff. I think probably what you probably need one more step. Like if you had a witness who said she was really close to Underhill and they were together a lot and she often helped him and she often drove him and they were friendly. Like if you could make that connection between the 16-year-old whose DNA we don't have, but we know drove the car, and Underhill, then I think you have a much stronger case. But you have to show that. And the DNA obviously is a powerful reason. There is DNA from this person, a hair from this person in a backpack, on a shirt, in a backpack, wrapped in 2 different plastic bags and buried. That probably didn't happen randomly. Now imagine though, if that's all you had. If all you had was the hair, it probably didn't happen randomly, but you could also imagine someone saying, look, she was 13, as Alice said, not much older than Asha. Maybe they ran into each other at some point. And somehow her hair traveled. And that's weird. That's crazy. But your hair is everywhere, right? So that could have happened. The fact that you have Underhill's DNA too, though, I mean, that just triangulates the whole thing. That locks the whole thing up, because then you have someone who's unrelated to both the 13-year-old and Asha, except through the Deadmans and through that green car, which they found.
And by the way, it's not just us triangulating. The affidavit specifically does the triangulating for the judge. The affidavit says the link between Underhill and Anna Lee are Roy and Connie. They say that specifically. That's why we know. It's really hard to be any more clear than that. That's why they're focused on Connie and Roy, right? Because they're not saying that Underhill is related to Anna Lee. Underhill might be related to, in some way, to the 16-year-old who drove the car, because maybe the 16-year-old drove Underhill at some point. We're making that leap of logic that you could potentially make to try and get an affidavit for the 16-year-old. But the fact that there are two unrelated DNAs, Underhill's not related to Anna Lee. There's no indication that he babysat Anna Lee, for example. So why would these two be on Asha's? And the police are saying the common denominator are Roy and Connie. And yeah, there was a third daughter. Why aren't we talking about her? Because she has absolutely no tie. Here, we don't have any indication she drove the suspected vehicle that may have been the crime scene because she wasn't old enough to drive. We have no indication that there's any DNA tying back to her. And just because they're all kids of Roy and Connie, you don't get grouped in just because you're siblings with someone whose hair is found on someone. So to this point, I can't think of it, unless in the diaries that they seized, they find some reason to include any description or explanation of the third daughter. She has nothing to do with this case at this point. And you don't need her in order to get a search warrant for the home that the parents owned.
So another thing that's in the affidavit, there was a witness who said that she had witnessed Roy digging a hole, which was described as a chest-deep hole on the property. And you can imagine how that would have fired up the police's mind, and you can see why that is something you'd want to look into. Now, it could be he was digging up a septic tank, for all we know, or burying a dog, right? But it also could be he was digging a grave. And I think that's one of the reasons you saw the police look into this property sort of as aggressively as they did.
And interesting in there, I think the note about the chest deep hole was back like 20 plus years ago. I think something like, yeah, it was back closer to the time that Asha disappeared, but that you can still see that the ground had been disturbed. Because that's a pretty deep hole. I mean, depends on how tall you are, but anyone's chest, we've talked about how hard it is to dig in the ground. So anything more than 6 inches is going to take some time and some effort, and there aren't that many reasons to need to self-dig a hole that deep. And they also include in this affidavit, which is something that we've talked about a lot, Asha's family. Harold, Aquila, and O'Brien Degree, who are the mom, dad, and brother of Asha Degree, they've been thoroughly investigated. They've taken polygraph tests, and with the current investigation, there's no indication that they have anything to do with Asha Degree's disappearance. And the other thing, we've kind of mentioned this, but you have to say what crime you think was committed here. And they say, I think this may be the first time they officially say it, even though a lot of us suspected it, when you find her backpack and her affects tied in a bag, buried in the ground, is that the police believe Asha was the victim of a homicide who was then concealed. In other words, they think she was murdered and her body has been concealed for all this time. So they're not looking for a live body, unfortunately. They are looking for remains. And they believe those remains can be found somewhere because someone has hidden them, just like they tried to hide the backpack.
And the paragraph about the parents and the brother, it's not just the police being kind. This is addressing potentially exculpatory evidence. So you're supposed to include potentially exculpatory evidence and how you deal with that. And obviously, I think one of the popular theories about Asha has always been that the family was involved in some way. We didn't think that was likely, but that has been a position people have taken. And you can imagine a defense attorney saying one day, look, they didn't even address the fact it could have been the parents. Well, what they're doing is they're saying, yes, we have looked at that. We looked into them and we investigated them, and we have no reason to think they're involved. And so to the extent the possibility that someone else did this would lead a judge to say you don't have probable cause to search this other third party's property, that's not a problem here. So that's why they're including that in the search warrant. Now, the Deadmans have a lawyer. That lawyer has spoken. He actually, I think, had a press conference before the search warrants actually came out. He said that both the Deadmans and their kids have all been questioned. They deny knowing anything about the disappearance of Asha Degree. And essentially, the lawyer blames it on Underhill. And I will say this. I think they're going to have to do better than that. Underhill's obviously dead. Now, his DNA was on the backpack, and that's important. But some story is going to have to be developed or released or something about how Underhill would have been in that car, or how the daughter's hair would have been in the vicinity of Underhill such that he could transfer that hair over to Asha. The car is a huge deal. And you think about, what are the chances that they actually kept any of the evidence? I think even when we did the initial podcast, we said, well, great, they're releasing this evidence about a car 18 years later. That car, nobody kept that car. Well, if this is the car, then they absolutely did keep the car. And I think that's one reason that the police were at least somewhat optimistic that they might find some sort of connection to Asha. The fact that that car was kept, if you assume, step one, that car was involved, and then they kept the car, well, then who knows what they kept, right? And I know everybody has questions. They want to know things. They want to know, why did Asha leave in the first place? I mean, all the questions we always have, and this information has only made us want to know even more, right? It's made you even hungrier for the truth. I'm telling you, this is the first part of this. This is not, I truly believe this is not a situation where there's a case that's pretty cold, then there's a flurry of activity, and then nothing happens for 10 years. I don't believe that. I think we're going to hear a lot more. Now, it may end up being that they have thoroughly investigated this and they have eliminated the Deadmans as suspects in whatever happened. That is absolutely possible. That could happen. But I think whatever is going to come of it, something is. We're going to get some movement in this case. And, you know, I'm hopeful that eventually it will answer all those questions you have. These affidavits don't. And the other thing, we don't know that we have all the search warrants. Just because we have the ones that have been executed and unsealed doesn't mean there aren't other search warrants under seal or that haven't been executed yet, or that have been executed but that haven't been released. I mean, I think it's interesting, for instance, that when you look at them, and unless I missed it, and like I said, these are all scans we're reading, so I very well could have missed it. You have these affidavits specifically for Connie Deadman and Annalee Deadman and their DNA, but you don't see one for Roy. And that makes me wonder if maybe there's a search warrant related to Roy that hasn't been unsealed. Don't know that. We're going to have to see, but don't think this is all the information that the police have, or that everything they've done has been unsealed. This investigation, I think, is probably really hot right now, and there's a lot going on in the background, and hopefully the police are following up on a lot of leads and talking to a lot of people and DNA swabbing that entire car, because you can find DNA that's old. Some people think this is a hit and run. I don't think it was a hit and run for all the reasons we've discussed, but if it was, who knows? You know, that car's been out in the elements, but maybe in the crevice of a dent in that car, there's DNA that could prove that. And that is all going to be something the police are going to be looking into. And I think this case, if it was cold, it's hot right now. And I'm hoping that we'll reach some sort of conclusion.
So with that, I want to also issue a kind of warning to the true crime world, because we've seen kind of armchair detectives and overzealous hypothesizers take up a lot of airspace in other cases. This case is hot. I am very heartened that there are developments in this case that we don't know about. I do not think now is the time to take the limited information that the affidavits, which are used in order to get probable cause to search specific locations, not meant to lay out an entire prosecution's case or to point fingers at who will ultimately be charged or what the theory is. Now is not the time to hypothesize about questions that these affidavits do not answer. Why she left, the motive, those sorts of things. Because I think there is a lot of development, and when there's a lot of outside noise, pressure that perhaps the Deadmans are going to feel, perhaps the Degrees are going to feel, perhaps the police or FBI are going to feel from a lot of people taking up airspace on speculation, nothing more than that, it could negatively affect the case. But if you know something about any of the people who've been listed, even if it's not on the night of February 14th or February 13th, 2000. But you know Underhill. You know Annalee. You went to school with them. You knew the Deadmans. You played at their house. You've ridden in that Rambler. You may remember something. If you know something, don't go broadcast it on a YouTube channel. Go tell the police, because that may be a link that they're looking for right now. So all I warn us is to not wildly speculate about things that we just don't know about. Obviously, when we covered this case years ago, we did. At the time, it was completely a cold case. We speculated about why she left that day, who she was meeting, who picked her up, what she met with. Those are important questions, but right now, these developments do not give us answers to those. They're not meant to give us answers to those. Doesn't mean the police isn't investigating or knows a lot more about it. But if you know information that can help them get to those answers, please tell them. Tell them right away. Rack your brain. A lot of you have said that you live in this vicinity. Maybe you do know the Deadmans. All we know right now is that the Deadmans didn't know the Degrees. Asha didn't know the Deadmans. So far, there's no connection. If you have personal knowledge that could connect them, let somebody know. And I'm hopeful that this will not be our last legal briefs. We're going to do another one, I hope, when there are more developments in the case. And I am very hopeful that even, a quarter of a century later, there may be justice for Asha. My heart sank when I read the line that she was likely the victim of homicide, even though I knew that's probably the fate she met that night. But the best thing from here is to give Asha's story closure and justice for whoever did this to her. And I think we are well on that path. Let us as a true crime community not stand in the way of it. But if anything, get her name out there and not be the speculators who stand in the way of justice.
Yeah, this is always hard because you hear information on a case that's been seemingly stagnant for 20 years and you are excited and you want it to be true and you want the police to be right and you want them to solve it. But it sure would be nice if they found, Asha living on an island somewhere, living her best life. I don't think we ever thought that was likely the case, particularly when that backpack was found. And I think if it is true, if the police are right, that Asha was murdered that night, then Alice has nailed it. We need to find justice for her. The family needs to be able to lay her to rest. They need to know what happened to her, and I'm hoping that we are close to that. Like Al said, if you have any information, reach out to the Shelby Police Department or the FBI. This is a hot case. Don't think your tip isn't important. They're going to get a ton of tips anyway, so maybe yours will be the one. Go ahead and let them know. If you're interested in our initial coverage of this case, I think it was episode 58 and 59 on our other podcast, The Prosecutors. I haven't listened to it in a while, so I'm actually curious to go back and listen to it and see what we initially said. But this is a case I think that the true crime community has really rallied around, and more so, in the last few years. And I think that there's a lot of people who are hoping and praying that this will be the resolution we're all looking for, and that would be amazing.
Absolutely. Well, thank you guys for this has been like a long journey. This really feels like, this was the first year of our podcast. We covered this case and it has been on my heart ever since then. So thank you for following along this journey and for finding the affidavits, the physical affidavits, so we can see them. Thank you guys. We really appreciate that. Please keep doing that and read the affidavits for yourself, guys. Everything we've talked about today comes straight from the affidavits. Before we sign off, Brett, do we have time for questions? People have asked for straight questions.
We can do questions if you want to. We've always got time.
We've always got time. We could also save them for like a Christmas episode if we want.
Yeah, well, we have been going a while. Maybe we'll do questions next time.
And tonight I've been talking about, like terrifying hotels that people fall off railings of. So I think this has been an eventful night already. Well, don't worry. We'll have lots of question and answers. If you leave a 5-star review, you can write us a question. We'll answer it either here on Legal Briefs or the Prosecutors Podcast. And if you have any legal developments in true crime cases you want us to cover, let us know. Send us, if you have the affidavits, send them over. If you have any court documents you want us to kind of make sense of, we would love to cover the things that you are interested in. But with that, Brett, do you have anything else to say before we sign off?
No, just keep up the good work, guys.
Yes, thank you guys so much. Reach out to us at prosecutorspod@gmail.com, on social media, the TikToks and the X's and the Twitters and the Facebook and Instagrams at prosecutorspod. We love hearing from you. Thank you guys for being such a wonderful community that respectfully discusses these types of cases and keeps cases like Asha Degrees at the forefront of people's minds. I think it made a difference here, and it may ultimately solve the case. But until next time, I'm Alice.
And I'm Brett.
And this is the Prosecutor's Legal Briefs.
Perfect.
Sounds great to me. All right. Well, see, we let 30 more people come.
There you go. It was all part of the plan.
All part of the plan.
Just a little bit. And you had time to think of a descriptor.
I definitely didn't think of one because all I could think about was this freaky hotel. I sent Brett a picture of the hotel, like looking up. Didn't you get nauseous looking at it?
Oh, I've been to that hotel before.
I know. I don't like it. I don't like that hotel.
Yeah, I could totally see leaping to your death after riding up that elevator.
I mean, truly, you can see all the